Go ahead.
So, shalom to everyone. Hello. I understand that this is part of your larger Yemei Iyun, and some of you hopped on Zoom to be with me here from Israel. So, thank you very much. When Rav Nati suggested I suggest a topic, and I thought, there's so many relevant biblical chapters to the way I'm feeling, and I think many of us are feeling these days, that we could have spoken about many of the prophecies, but I chose this to spend our shiur teaching the book of Haggai. Haggai is not such a large book. We'll see in a minute. So we'll basically cover the book in the coming hour. But before we cover Haggai, I want to give a little bit historical background, because I think that's the best way for us to actually have a better understanding of what was the historical context or the framework of the teachings of Haggai, which is necessary for understanding his prophecy, but also for us to really understand, I think, why it's so relevant to us for us today. So I'm starting from like the basic knowledge. The historical context of the book of Haggai is in the first years of the return to Zion. But let's just remember where we are, zoom out for a minute. Most people are familiar with the first temple years more than they are of the second temple years. So I'm starting from the first exile at 597 BCE, which is what we call the Galut Yoyachin, the Jehoiachin exile. It was the first time that actually Jews were exiled to Babylonia and also kept their Jewish identity in diaspora. Meaning, if I'll just take one minute to explain why I'm saying this was the first time, we all know the 10 tribes were exiled about 150 years earlier at 732 BC, and 722 BC was the final exile of the Israelites in the northern part of Israel. But when they went to Assyria, when they were exiled, we don't know anything about them keeping separate communities of Judeans within the exile. The first time we have a recording within the Bible and outside of the Bible, within the Tanakh and out of the Tanakh, specifically mentioning the fact that although the Jews still live in Israel, they should keep their own Jewish identity in exile, is after the Yehoiachin exile, which is why I'm starting at 597, because I think that's the most significant turning point for understanding diaspora Jewry, at least from when we go back to the first and the second temples, which is what Haggai will be talking about. So that's 597. About approximately 12 years later, the first temple is destroyed. We have another exilic community that goes to exile and joins the first exiles in 597. And then we have 50 years approximately, give or take, until Cyrus's declaration, which comes at 538 BCE, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. But basically, it's an opportunity for the Jews to come back and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Haggai is going to speak approximately 15 years after the Cyrus's declaration, or 18 years after the Cyrus's declaration. But this is the framework we're working with. We're working with a framework of about 50 years after the first temple was destroyed, when there's the first time an opportunity for Jews who are sitting in Babylonia, waiting for the temple to be rebuilt, to come back to Israel and build the what we will later name the second temple. Now, if we listen to the prophecies of Yirmiyahu and of Yechezkel, then we hear very clearly that the destruction of the first temple was not the only turning point. Meaning, we fast Tisha B'Av because of the destruction of the first temple. That obviously makes it a very significant turning point. But as far as the book of Yechezkel is concerned, and the prophet is extremely clear about it. When the temple was burnt down, God was not in his temple anymore. God had left the temple years before, which is why the burning down of the temple, although it is extremely significant, it is not the most significant day, but there's a very significant period where within this period we have the exiles that go to Babylonia once, we have the exiles that go to Babylonia a second time, we have the burning down of the first temple, and then again we will have another very significant event, which is the assassination, the Retzach Gedaliah, which is why we have the fast of Gedaliah. Why am I saying this? Because we will see that it's extremely significant for understanding Haggai. Just like the temples being destroyed on Tisha B'Av, according to the Nevi'im, was not one day a specific turning point that from then we have to count on, but there was a tkufa, there was a decade, there was a whole period of time where God left his temple, where exiles went to Babylonia, and things happened gradually. The rebuilding of the second temple, as we will see in Haggai, is also a process, which is part of what becomes very, I would say, frustrating with those of the Jews that thought that God would return back to his temple, they would rebuild a second temple, it would be an amazing temple, and things would be similar to what they were during maybe the time of the first temple when it was built, like in Solomon or Shlomo's days. That's not what we hear. The book of Haggai comes to actually tell us that rebuilding a temple does not happen overnight, and it's a process that people have to be willing to be part of. And actually, that's just like the first temple was destroyed, even though we note Tisha B'Av, we're actually discussing part of a process. In order to understand the book of Haggai, we have to start from the book of Ezra, which is where I want to start. I'll just explain for 1 minute for those of you who are less familiar also with the book of Ezra. The book of Ezra is later. It comes after the book of Haggai, but its opening chapters have a retrospective perception of the events that actually happened from Cyrus's declaration. So even though if we're talking strictly about the years of the book of Ezra, we're probably talking not about 538 when Cyrus's declaration comes about, but about 100 years later, 460, 450, 440 BC, much later when Ezra and Nehemiah come, that's the only book that actually gives us a detailed story of what happened after Cyrus's declaration in Israel. So we're looking at a book at this retrospective prophecy that describes what had actually happened. So here's the nevuah. ובשנת אחת לכורש מלך פרס. I'll just note that Safari is in charge of all these translations. As an Israeli, I didn't try to go around correcting them, but it might not be the best of translations to these verses. So I'll translate them as I go along using my English, but I brought the English up here too, just for your convenience. So, בשנת אחת לכורש מלך פרס, the first year of Koresh, Cyrus, the king of Persia. And here's a very important first point. Lichlot dvar Hashem mipi Yirmiyah. So according to Ezra, 538, the year that Cyrus is now calling the Jews to come back to Israel, is the year that, it's very significant, that the nevuah of Hashem to Yirmiyahu has now ended. What's the nevuah of Hashem to Yirmiyahu that has now ended? That 70 years have passed and the temple should be rebuilt. Now have this in mind because we'll go back to this verse and ask when the 70 years pass and why. But it's very clear that Ezra wants to say that when Cyrus's declaration came about, someone said here that you're not seeing the screen I'm reading from. Why is that? What did you not see?
If you were reading from the Psukim, that was not on the
First we saw this. Did you see this?
Oh.
No.
Okay, so you weren't with me. And then, so these were the final years, 597, 586, 538. And then we were looking at this, and now we are looking at this, okay? I'm going to try again to, and just tell me, do you see it now?
Can you make but can you make it
Yes.
bigger? It's too small to read.
I'm not sure, actually. Can we, let's try to stick it. That's what happens when I add English and Hebrew. I'll read it out loud. I just don't want to spend the time playing with the PowerPoint presentation just in case I lose it, okay? So let me go back to say that we're talking about here the year that God calls, apparently, the Cyrus, right? Lekoresh melech Paras. Why that then? Because that's when the Nevuah to Yirmiyahu, the 7 years will have passed and finished. And now will be the time for the Jews to rebuild their temple. He'ir Hashem et ruach Koresh melech Paras. God who has arisen Koresh's spirit, the king of Persia's spirit, and he called throughout his whole empire, and also in a letter to say. What did the letter say, or what did the calling say? So said the king of Persia, God gave me all the land of the empire, or all the nations that live within the empire. And he's told me to rebuild a temple, or to rebuild him a temple in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Anyone who wants to join his God should come now to Jerusalem and build, and he should build the temple that's God's temple. Now, this already frames the historical events in a different way from what they were perceived for Jews sitting in Babylonia, which now is ruled by the Persians. Do you see now the temples in Persia?
We
No.
see the Psukim.
Yeah, we see the same.
You see the verses? Okay, so I'm just, how about this? Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. This is what, maybe I'll just exit the full screen so I won't have to. Okay, we'll do it this way. You'll just see what comes next, and then we'll all see. You'll all make sure we see that as we go along. So this is what the Jews sitting in Persia, that had now become Persia, seen around them. What they saw around them was not a worldwide recognition of a Jewish, or I should call it, if I don't want to be anachronistic, Judean God, or a recognition in a Judean God that tells Cyrus that he can enable the Jews to build God's temple, because now there's a world recognition in the Jewish God. That's what the verses make it sound like. But if we look at the historical events, Persia had a whole bunch of temples. Their largest temple you can see here was this is some kind of reconstruction that actually you can see clearly tries here to, on this part, if you can see my mouse, to actually worship the god Marduk. He's the largest god, or the most powerful god. His temple is the most powerful temple, among others. And what really happens in practice is that this declaration of Cyrus, which now you can see here in a picture from the British Museum, is what we see here is not the quote that we see in the biblical text, but a parallel declaration which Cyrus calls, which Cyrus calls other countries, or I would say he calls other nations that he's now ruling to each build their own temple. So if I go back to this picture of the temples in Persia, the Jews are not offered an opportunity to be recognized worldwide, or for Cyrus to understand that now he sees or understands the powers of the Jewish God. Instead, what he sees, or what we know now from the declaration of Cyrus, which is just a general declaration for each nation to go back to their homeland and build their own temple, that he actually ruled, and now you can see the Persian map, over a very large empire, which, as opposed to the Assyrians that conquered it face by face, he got it all at once under his control once he conquered the Babylonians. And his way of ruling was actually to say, I don't want anyone to come against me. I don't want to have any rebellious nations here. What I will do is make sure that everyone is busy with their own, building their own temple. giving me the taxes that should come with. And in that way, I'll make sure that no one wants to come against the Persian Empire. So all we have from the historical perspective is a different way of ruling. And it does not play out as a universal recognition of God. For that reason, maybe I'll go back for a minute to where you hadn't seen, which is here. Even though Cyrus's declaration was at year 538, until the year 520, nothing really happens in Israel. And that's, or in Judea. And that's even though, according to the way the historical events are framed in the first chapter of Isra, the time has come already at 538, right after Cyrus's declaration, for the Judeans to rebuild the temple. What actually happened in practice will come Haggai, and we'll see him in a few more minutes, and tell them by 520, where are you standing? Why aren't you rebuilding the temple? I gave you this opportunity to build a second temple. People actually start building. 2 years within the building of the second temple, they ask themselves, is this the real thing? Is this what God had in mind? Was this God's plan? How do I know? Because in the book of Zechariah, they ask very clearly in the chapter 7 and 8, should we cancel the fast days for burning, for that we're still marking for the burning down on the first temple? Theoretically, if we're fasting for a first temple, and now we're building a second one, then we don't need to fast anymore, right? But they're very ambivalent towards the question of should the fasts continue. And to make the long story short, I'll actually say that many Judeans, and probably also Jews living in Babylonia, continue fasting for the burning down of the first temple throughout the 600 years of the second temple. The second temple was finally finished and institutionalized in here. You can see in 516 BCE. We know it lasted until 70, until it was burnt down. And we have very specific descriptions of what is probably is a dispute between different communities, maybe some in Jerusalem, some in Babylonia, which is now Persia, arguing whether they should continue the fast or not. And that actually is very, to my mind, it's very substantial, because this argument or this conversation reflects on how ambivalent they were towards the fact, is this the real thing? Which is why many of them continue to fast, because they have the feeling this is not the real thing. This is not what building the temple is supposed to look like. Now, not only one more, a few more verses from the book of Ezra. Here I'll enlarge a little bit. Can you see the continuation of Ezra now? So not only is there a general declaration saying whoever wants can come, but it's not about recognizing Hashem. It's just, you can build, that's a better way for me to govern you. It specifically says in the declaration, or in the opportunity when Ezra describes it, and anyone who wants to stay put and doesn't want to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the second temple, don't bother. All you have to do is send kesef, zahav, rechush, behemayim, menedeva levet elokim asher b'Yerushalayim. Meaning, the Cyrus makes it very clear from day one, you don't have to go back to Jerusalem. I'm not pushing you there. I'm just telling you there's an option for you guys to build your temple in Jerusalem if you want to go back to your homeland. But if you want to stay put, that's fine too. And you can be part of the community that's going to be rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem just by sending the means in order to enable them to build it. And then the verses say very specifically, who came back? So the personnel that came back are these people that have positions that can be part of an active temple sacrifices and ritual when they get to Jerusalem. So there were these people, Rashi Avot, as I said, the personnel, the priests, the Levites. These are the people that are really also, let's remember, they also get salaries from the temple, and they not only worship their God, but they also have incomes. And who else went with them? We don't know. What do we know about the people that weren't priests or Levites or the head of the tribes? All we know about them is so anyone around them send with them different goods. It could be gold, it could be silver, it could be other precious objects. And they basically other people didn't join, but they send them anything they wanted. And so did Cyrus. He also helped out with המלך כורש הוציא את כלי בית השם אשר הוציא נבוכדנצר מירושלים ויתנם בבית אלוהיו. And Cyrus also helped out by sending back some of the vessels, some of the temple vessels. I moved on. Do you see the Al Yehudu clay tablets? Okay. We'll share this again. And now you can see another very significant piece of evidence. Now you can see them, the Al Yehudu clay tablets. Now you can see another very significant piece of evidence to what happened to those that, as the prophet describes, did not plan on joining. So we know from a very interesting discovery that was presented in the Babylonian Museum about 10 years ago, maybe a little less, and there's still some of the tablets there. They're also in the Israel Museum, there are a few, and there's many in the British Museum. But what we know is from these tablets that there was a Judean community that sat here not far from Nippur. Here's Shushan, here's Bavel, the main city, here's Baghdad. And we know a lot from the Al Yehudu clay tablets about, unfortunately, we don't know about their rituals or about their culture, but we do know about their financial situation. The tablets tell us or recover two findings. One is that the Al Yehudu Jewish town were lived in a separate community, and they were recognized as Jews, which is why they're called Al Yehudu, the town of the Jews. They have Jewish names. That means that they have theophoric names. That means that God's name is in them, like Shilmaya. Okay, yeah, inside. There was Nehemiah, and there was Al Yeshuv, like El Yeshuv, God will return. And here we can see an example of Shilmaya ben Nedaviah. So you can see they have Jewish names. And not only do they have Jewish names, even though they use the script that's common by the local authorities to write documents, you can see here there was a scribe that left his name, Shelmaya, on the side of the clay tablet, and he wrote it in Hebrew letters. So you can see that they were involved in the local merchandise. They buy and they sell barley and dates, and they owe different amounts of barley or different other grains because they're now working as farmers in local Persians fields. And some of them actually get to a stage where they own part of these fields, and they also sell and buy slaves, and they sell and buy different animals that can help them out. And we actually see that they all have, you can see it here, witnesses, and the witnesses aren't necessarily Jews, and they all have a scribe. Scribe isn't necessarily a Jew. For instance, if you look at this name here, it says Nabunatsir. Nabu is the name of the Babylonian god. So just like we have Shelmaya, they might have a name of Nabunatsir. Okay, so we have different representatives that represent different gods, which show us that the Jews were also very much involved in the local communities, and at least some of them were pretty well off. They were not all living like we might think as slaves in Persia, which was why it's clear to understand why many of them don't have the incentive we might have thought that they would have to actually return, because you can take it two ways. It's either you have to understand you have to be pretty well off financially in order to make the whole journey home back to Israel. And then you have to understand that it's only relevant for people from a certain economic status. Or you can also say, which is probably also true, You have to have a life that's not good enough, or a life that you're willing to risk, because once you come to Jerusalem, if your financial situation is based on the fact that you have fields of barley or that you grow dates, that's not something that you're going to take along with you to Jerusalem. That is the background for understanding Haggai. But one last text before we go to Haggai. Just to understand that when they finally came to Israel, and I'm talking about 538 after Cyrus's declaration, they come, it's the 7th month, it's the month of Tishrei. They start building. They build an altar, v'yivnu et hamizbeach. They start giving sacrifices on it, even though the temple's not built yet. And they even do a Sukkot. And then they stop, meaning after they're coming back, building an altar, giving sacrifices, that's 538. Now they stop, and now we finally can read Haggai and understand Haggai. We are now in the year 520 BCE. We are 18 years after Cyrus's declaration. 18 very disappointing years where nothing really is moving here in Israel or in Jerusalem. All they succeeded in building was putting down some kind of foundation and having some kind of altar that they give some kind of sacrifices on. And the Judeans are actually divided into two communities, or I should say two that we discussed, because there's also a substantial community in Egypt of Judeans that moved to Egypt, and we know that from Jeremiah and later from the Al-Fatin document. So there's another third community that we're not talking about today. And that's the backdrop in order to understand Haggai. Can you see Haggai? Yeah? Okay. Vishnat Shtaim LeDaryavish. So that's why I know that the year is 520, because we're in the second year of Daryavish. The Persian kings go Cyrus, Koresh. Then there's a king called Kanbuzi that's not mentioned in the Bible. Nothing substantial happened in his names. And then there's the next year king called Daryavish. So we're in his second year. B'chodesh HaShishi, in the 6th month, Bayom Echad LaChodesh, the first day of the month, Hayat Dvar Hashem B'yad Haggai HaNavi. Haggai calls out to Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel Pachat Yehuda. Notice that we don't have a local king anymore. We don't have the same functionaries we were used to in the first temple. The setting is totally different. There's a prophet, his name is Haggai, and when he wants to talk to the leadership, who does he talk to? He talks to Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel Pachat Yehuda. Pachat is a Persian name used to say who is the functionaries in charge. Ve'el Yoshua ben Yotzadak Kohen Gadol, and the high priest. And what does he tell them? Now notice that I'm going to read this verse with an intuition, but an intuition that can be argued. You can say he either calls there, I would say almost begging. כה אמר השם צבאות לאמור, העם הזה אמרו, you guys are telling me, or telling me is representing God. לא את בו את בית השם לבנות. This is what you guys think. You guys think, put here 2 dots, and then a quote. העם הזה אמרו, what did the people say? The time has not come yet. לא את, it is time, בו has not come, את בית השם לבנות. So it's either almost begging, almost crying. This is the description. Or maybe it's a scream. Maybe he's very, very, I would say, dominant at saying, putting his step down, saying, how could it be that you're saying the time has not come to build the second temple? And now he wants to tell them that their expectations are wrong. The way they see the historical events is wrong. And their whole perception of what it should look like when the second temple is being built should be looked at totally different. ויהי דבר השם ביד חגי הנביא לאמור, העת לכם אתם לשבת בבתיכם ספונים והבית הזה חרב. What do you expect? Do you expect to sit in your own house, לשבת בבתיכם, ספונים, all the way in the back of your house, not coming out anywhere. While this house is still in the ruins, while this house is still destroyed. That's not what I see in my mind. It's not, your expectations aren't what my expectations were from you. And now he describes I would say, the gap between God's perspective to the current events and their perspective to the current events. God's perspectives from the current events were, first of all, that the second temple should be rebuilt and they should not be dwelling in their houses. But now I want to show for a minute what the verses say about their perspective. Their perspective is, and we can see it through God, the prophet's calling, ואתם הרבה והווה מעט, אכול ואין לשובעה, שתו ואין לשוכרה, לבוש ואין לחום לו, והמשתכר משתכר על צרור נחור. You're looking around and you're saying we can barely find the means to survive financially. We don't have enough, we don't have enough grains, we don't have what to eat, we're constantly hungry, we don't have enough grapes even to make wine, we don't have enough yarn to have food. We don't have bread. Anything we make does not comes to the means that we expected or to the income we expected. And here is a now I want to come to a very substantial part of the conversation between God and the people. The people had this idea that building the second temple would look like would be like magic, would be as if the temple would come from heaven, or maybe at least they would feel God was with them, or that there would be a general understanding around the world that God, the Jewish God, is the one to be recognized as the main God, the real God, etc. They're looking at their friends that still live in Persia, and they're thinking to themselves, we made the effort to come here. It has to come across as obviously as the right choice. And instead, they come to Israel, they hear a declaration that doesn't recognize God the way they thought it would, meaning it's a general opportunity for all the nations governed by the Persian Empire to build temples, but it's not a general recognition of God, the Jewish God, being almighty, being stronger or more capable of the Persian gods or any other gods under this, governed by this empire. And then when they finally come to Israel, they also barely can have enough grain to have what to eat. And now the question is, how should the situation be changed? How can we have a first temple or something like the first temple materialize across our eyes? And God's response to that is, if you start building, my glory will be present in this temple. That's why he tells them, go up to the hills, rebuild the house, and I will then bring in my glory into your house. And don't be frustrated that your grains aren't striving the way you thought they would be. And don't be frustrated that this house doesn't look like you anticipated to look like, because what we see now is what we see now is my house is full of ruins, and you are running each to your own house. Now you can see that the prophet very clearly plays on the word house. My house is in the ruins. You are running each to your own house, right? Beforehand, they were sitting each in the back of their own houses instead of taking care of God's house so his glory can come back to a house. We can really see this dialogue in a literary perspective by seeing a conversation about what's the gap between how you expected my house, God's telling them, how you expected my house as in God's temple to look like and be rebuilt. And where did you think that would bring, or how did you think that would imply on your own personal house? Your expectations were that something would happen maybe from heaven, that everything would be clearly recognized from day one. God would be recognized from day one. your agriculture would bring that about too. You would have something that maybe was not like you thought it would be, which is, such a hard time actually just having the grains in order to live. And I'm telling you, and that's God's basically prophet to Haggai, which he wants them to tell the people, I'm telling you, it's in your hand. And it's not going to happen in this miraculous way, but it's going to happen if you actually look at the reality and make the best of it and don't run each to your own house. And instead of that, go be proactive and build my temple. Now, look what he says. I think this is the hardest verse in the book, because here in the next verse, he tells them, you can't figure out why there's no rain, because rain or a drought is significant for something broken in the relationship between God and his people. And you're looking around and you're saying, if there's no rain, maybe God doesn't want us to build this temple, or maybe this is not the right thing, or maybe this is not working, or maybe we weren't supposed to come back. Maybe the 70 years that Cyrus's declaration, from the view of Ezra's quoting Jeremiah saying, here time has come to build the house, maybe these 70 years actually never ended. Maybe it's not the right time. Maybe it's not lichlot v'Hashem mipi Yirmiyahu. And the prophet's telling them, the reason there's a drought is, and there's no water, and the grains aren't coming up and they aren't growing. Yes, there's a drought now, but it's because you are not active in bringing God's temple to be rebuilt, meaning it's almost 20 years now, from 538 to 520. And you're not moving in any way that's substantial for my temple to be rebuilt, which is why you have a drought. And I said it, to my mind, that's the hardest verse, because to understand that the people really don't have enough grains to actually survive, and that God's response to them is, yes, there aren't enough grains because you expected the rain to come from heaven just because you're back, and you're not understanding that it'll come from heaven when you become proactive about rebuilding the temple. I think really, really demonstrate the clash between the expectations between the people and the prophecy from Haggai. I just brought one verse that has to do with the question that I posed about whether, from Zechariah, about the question that I posed, whether should we continue fasting for the fast of the first temple. I think now it's even clearer why, when they built the second temple, they were asking, should we stop fasting? Because they looked around, they said, there's a drought, the building's not being built. This doesn't seem to be the real thing. Now notice what God responds when they ask, should we stop fasting? God replies, it's up to you. כה אמר השם צבאות, צום הרביעי, that's י"ז בתמוז, וצום החמישי, that's תשע באב, וצום השביעי, that's צום גדליה, וצום העשירי, that's עשרה בטבת, יהיה לבית יהודה לששון ושמחה. They will all be joyous days. Is that an answer to the question, should we stop fasting now? Will they be joyous days now? There's no answer. Meaning that basically what God's telling them in the book of Zechariah, which complements what he tells them in the book of Haggai, is, it's up to you. I cannot give you a precise answer to the question, or a clear-cut answer to the question of should we stop fasting. It's up to you. One day these days will be joyous days. Is it going to happen now when the second temple is being rebuilt? I don't know. It depends what your actions are, how you respond to the opportunity I gave you to build the second temple. Now, what happens in Haggai? I'm going back to Haggai. In Haggai, the people hear the call that they actually are given by the prophet, and this is their response. וישמע זרובבל בן שלתיאל ויהושע בן יהוצדק הכהן הגדול וכל שארית העם, notice the word שארית, I want to say something about it in a minute, בקול השם אלוהיהם ועל דבר חגי הנביא כאשר שלחו השם אלוהיהם ויראו העם מפני השם. So first of all, They hear the prophet, and what we hear, first of all, is that they are called the remnant. They're the she'erit, which is very substantial here because I think that's part of the debate. The debate is who's central? Are the people living in Persia, that used to be Babylonian, are they the central community? And are we just in the margins, the people saying here, are we just the she'erit? Or can we, the people that now feel as the she'erit and feel like we're on the margins, become the most central people and make ourselves the central community? It's like saying which one would be the central community and which one would be the liaison, which one would be the community that in order to stand has to have some kind of connection to the central place, just like you would have a main city and you would have suburbs. So the question here is, which community is the main city? And you can see through this dialogue that when the Judeans come back to Jerusalem, they don't become this central city or the main place where the Judeans are located all at once. What we see is kind of an argumentation about can we and are we becoming central? Are we and can we become, I would say, substantial, not only to whoever is living here in Yehuda, but also to the people that are still not here, still in diaspora. And what does the dialogue continue? ויאמר חגי מלאך השם במלכות השם לעם לאמור, אני איתכם נאום השם. I know you feel like this, the current situation makes everything seem like maybe God's even not with us. Maybe it makes it seem like he's not present. Maybe this is not the real thing. Maybe the time hasn't come. Maybe the fact that we didn't all come back means that we're not in appropriate situation to actually receive God's glory to come into this building that we're building now. Maybe it won't even be called the second temple. And Haggai's reassuring them, this is the real thing. This will be the second temple. Here he kind of raises their spirits. ואת יהושע הכהן הגדול, ואת רוח כל שארית העם, the remnant of the people. ויבואו ויעשו את המלאכה בבית השם צבאות. And this is when the rebuilding of the temple starts. And it's the rebuilding of the temple in the year 520 starts and continues, as I said, in 518 until 516, until there's actually a building that's being built and can actually be seen as at least for the first level it's done, is only after this very, very, I would say, substantial dialogue. And the reason it's so substantial is because it's about changing their perspective. Their perspective was that God would bring the temple from heaven. And Haggai tells them, it's up to you, and it'll be what you'll make out of it. And the temple will be built not just because the time has passed or 70 years have passed, but based on your actions. And God's glory will be in it, not because the whole world will recognize it, but because you won't be running each to your own house. You'll be spending the best of your time building God's temple. And not because there's a lot of rain and everything is easy, but because you prioritize building God's temple over other options that you had. Now, Haggai has to reassure them. It's not easy at all. But time passes, and you can see that they are still very disappointed. They say, and look at the letters I enlarged, Mi bachem, you see it? Mi bachem, hanish'ar asher ra'a et habayit hazeh harishon. Those of you who recall what the first temple was like are now very disappointed. U'ma atem ro'im oto ata lo kamo ke'ayin beinechem. It seems like the current temple is like nothing. It doesn't meet your expectations at all. And not only does it not meet your expectations, I want to say more than that. Malachi, which is considered to be the last prophet, I called it here Chalom v'Shivro, the dream, the shattered dream. Why did I call it the shattered dream? Because he actually, when the temple is finally built, what he has to say about it is, priests, your actions are in a way that I can't even recognize or I can't even admit the fact that something now has changed. So I want to go back and say that when we look, I think, at the do you see now the timeline? When we go back to the timeline, and we ask ourselves, what actually happened during the second or the first years of the Second Temple? What we learn is that the people's expectations were that the temple would come down from heaven. And what happened in reality was that the Second Temple depended on how people's actions were. And it really started moving along when they saw that it's up to them. And until they did, well, as long as they didn't understand it was up to them, reality wasn't changing. When they saw it was up to them, that's when the Second Temple was actually institutionalized. Thank you. I see we have 3 more minutes, and I see there are a few questions. So anyone want to ask? I'm available. Let's see. Does anyone want to ask anything?
Yes. Just a quick question. Could you just say again about when this who talks about the 70 years, and do they decide that it really wasn't 70 years, or how does that work in terms of?
Okay, it's not. That's a topic for another class, but I'll just say that we have.
You mentioned it.
Yeah. I'll say briefly. We have Ezra mentions the 70 years in his retrospective descriptions, beginning of the book. Jeremiah speaks about 70 years, and Daniel speaks about 70 years. They can be counted in 2 ways. If you bear with me for a minute, then it can be counted either from 605 BCE, which is the Babylonian rise, until 538 BCE, which is when the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. So that would be one way of calculating, give or take 70 years, give or take a year on each side, that reaches 70 years. That was probably the initial understanding, or the initial way that they understood Jeremiah. That did not materialize. As we all know, 538, the temple was not institutionalized. It took until 516. So an alternative way to count would be from the destruction of the first temple at 586 until 516. Do we see here a lechatchila and a diavad situation, meaning what was the first thought and the afterthought? Or do we see 2 alternatives? Is really an excellent topic for another shiur, and we can say a lot about it. But I'll just say in a nutshell that obviously the way Ezra's framing it is that he really expected the 70 years to end in Cyrus's declaration, which turned out not to be the case.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. We have 1 more minute. If anyone else wants to ask anything, I see Rav Shirlo is ready here now. So, Rav Nati, thank you very much.